Good evening and welcome. My name is Louisa Uliette. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm curator of talks and events here at the Photographers Gallery. It's a pleasure to be here to introduce tonight's talk with Michelle Henning. We often think of photography as a medium of light, vision, and representation, a way of capturing and preserving what is visible. But as Michelle Henning's research demonstrates, photography is also something else. It's a material grounded in chemistry, shaped by extraction, and deeply entangled in the histories of empire. In A Dirty History of Photography, Chemistry, Fog, and Empire, Michelle invites us to look beyond the image itself and attend instead to the infrastructure that makes photography possible, from silver mining and chemical processes to the environmental and political conditions that underpin photographic production. This perspective challenges us to consider what photographs are and what they do. It asks us to consider not only what images show, but also what they hold, the labor, resources, and histories that remain just out of the frame. So tonight we'll explore these ideas and much more with Michelle, thinking through questions of materiality, visibility, power, and reflecting on what it means to engage with photography differently in the present. We'll be here for roughly 40 minutes of the presentation, and then there'll be time for questions and contributions from you. We are recording this, so if you have any questions about that, let me know. And if you do have any questions or contributions, I ask that you wait for the microphone. In terms of washrooms, there are washrooms on every floor. In case of a fire alarm, we will leave together through the door over there. And there is a book sale and signing afterwards. So please let us know if you have any questions about that. And my colleague, I just want to thank my colleagues Sam Mercer and Martin Steinberger. And please join me in welcoming Michelle Henning.
Can you hear me at the back?
Yes.
Good. Okay, so I'm here to flog you my book. No, I'm here to talk about A Dirty History of Photography. This is the book, as you can see. It's, I guess, I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes, and there are intertitles just because I haven't got notes, so that's structuring it for me. But if you do feel like heckling, save it for the intertitles. You can boo and things at those. So the book is part, I guess, of a kind of, I didn't realise it when I started writing it. It was part of a kind of group of publications, books that are there's a lot of scholars increasingly interested in the materiality of film and photography. The first one I read, which I read before writing my book, was Esther Leslie's Synthetic Worlds. But these others are kind of came out while I was working on it, or just as I finished. And it's sometimes described as a material turn, as a turn away from the image, so the focusing on the materials of photography instead of thinking about actual images. But what I try to do is both. I try to have my cake and eat it. So I'm in the book, I'm interested in atmosphere, and I'm interested in, so I'm looking not so much at extraction as at the kind of polluted fog and atmospheric impact on photography. So I think of atmosphere in two senses. One is the kind of meteorological sense, and then the other is the kind of aesthetic sense, so the atmosphere of an image, and how those two things come together. So I do look, most of it's set in the interwar period, 1920s and 30s, but I do look at pictures from other times in order to think, so sort of using photographers as theorists, using them to help me think through images. So I look at Foucault's work from his famous photo book, Ravens. I look at Hervé Guibert's Photographienne in quite a lot of detail in order to talk about the photographic effect of halation and also sedation. I look at Wolfgang Suschitsky's work, and the photograph on the cover is one of his. His photographs from the 1930s of the Charing Cross Road, and how he looks at labour and work in relation to the kind of thick atmosphere of London. So this is the first intertitle. So obviously it's in the title, Fog. So one of the ways in which the book started, or I started to understand what I was focusing on, was because I found this in the Redbridge Museum and Heritage Centre in Ilford. And I was researching Ilford Limited Photographic Company, and their archives are kept there in Ilford, surprisingly. This is an experiment book. So in these books, the company chemist would note things, and this was some pages about fogging. Now, those of you who are photographers will know that fogging has a specific meaning in photography. It's a visual effect caused usually by some kind of contamination, whether that's in the air, in the water you wash it in, through light coming into the camera. It could be many things that cause fog. But this is interesting because in 1923, someone wrote a note saying, "We've decided in future coating of any kind of emulsion must not be commenced or proceeded with during a fog, as the risk is not worth the small gain we aim at in coating during a fog." So the gain would be if there's cold, moist air, it allows, it will stop the film or the paper from curling. But the trouble is the fog is full of sulfates and hydrogen sulfide, horrible chemicals that contaminate and fog the photographic plates. So I suddenly realised that the word fogging actually had something to do with the fog, the London fog. And that made me kind of think, oh, fog, maybe I've got something in this. And this is a photograph from later than the period I focus on. So it's from 1945, after a rocket hit the drying rooms of the Ilford Limited factory. So they had lots of factories by this point, but the main original factory was in Ilford. And I just like this photograph because it shows how close the gasworks were to the factory, and it also allows me to illustrate something that I don't have a photograph of, which is that in 1899, that gasworks produced a sudden large amount of hydrogen sulfide emissions that caused 25,000, but I'm not good at zeros, could be 2,500, 25,000, I think, plates, glass plates, to become contaminated, to be fogged. So the company decided they had to make a decision, like, are we going to build a factory further away from the London fog and the gasworks? Are we going to try and keep the fog out in some way? And they did both. So they built a factory out in Essex, but they also invented air conditioning. And they're one of the first companies ever to invent a system of air conditioning, because air conditioning, as you may know, is not just a heating and cooling system, it's a means of cleaning the air. So it's an air washing system. So if you look at, this gives just another illustration. So the factory, the Ilford's factory was here between Britannia Road and Roden Street in this area, and here's your gasworks here. And this is a photograph from 1906 showing the coal being delivered to the gasworks, because of course in this time in Britain, gas was made from coal. So even while, you think of the Great London fogs as a 19th century phenomenon, but then not really. They continue right up to the 1950s. But what happens is the centre of London gets cleaned up, but the peripheries, these places where people had built things like photographic factories precisely because there was clean air, become more filthy because the gasworks move out there, and the gasworks are coal-fired. But the gasworks, anyway, so I had an idea that maybe, you know how the Victorians used to call photography, they used to say that photography was the way in which the sun drew its own picture. And I thought, well, what if the fog could draw its own picture? So what if the fog is doing a self-portrait somehow? What if we could find in photographs some kind of trace of the fog? And this is one of the most famous fogs, the Great Fog of 1952. I think there's estimates of up to around 4,000 people, or maybe 40, I don't know. Again, you have to just read the book. I can't do numbers. But yeah, lots of people died as a result of this Great Fog. But what I was interested in was that these images are circulating online as pictures of the fog. And nobody's pointing out that what's happened to these photographs? They're very damaged. They look like this one looks like it's been painted all over. It's got big fingerprints on as well. And this one's got splatters and scratches and dots and splots. And so I went to Getty Images Holton Archive, which is in London, to look at these and see if I could figure it out. And that's negative from of this scan. So what they must have done at the archive is scanned directly from the negative. And they could have done that, relatively recently, in the last sort of 10, 20 years. But every other glass plate in the same box, which are all were all taken around the same time, but not during the fog, is perfectly fine. Just that one plate, which is the top plate in the box. So I started thinking, yes, I've got it. But of course, there's no way of knowing who sprayed the scanning machine before they scanned the negative. What did they, what's in the cardboard at the top of the box that's leached into the... There's no way of knowing that the fog really painted its own picture, which is disappointing. But it then gave me this thought, well, fog may not be able to be traced in that way, or we can't prove it. But obviously photographers were drawn to fog for particular reasons, and fog is very well photographed, even though it's incredibly difficult to photograph for various reasons. So Robin Kelsey, in his book on photography and the art of chance, talks about how mist and fog were these kind of metaphors for sentiment, emotion, memory, that they could be used to... It's basically pictorialist photographers like P.H. Emerson found that one of the great things about things like fog and smoke is it softened the sharpness of photography, so it made it feel a bit more like painterly impressionism. So it gave it a kind of more artistic feel, but also a more mysterious feel, because not everything is revealed. And you get this idea in this guy, Walter Bennington, who sees the smoky chimneys of London as standing for body matter and against the spirituality of the dome of St. Paul's. So they have this very kind of strong symbolism attached to the fog. The fog means something for them. But then I started looking again at the other fog images that you find in the Getty Images archive. And so when you look at the pictures from the 1920s and 30s, you start to see, we start to see is film noir, and film noir hasn't really happened yet, so that's fun. But also, you start to see a kind of iconography of London. So how do press photographers make use of the fog? Just to give you a little bit of background to this, it's before the 1930s, it's very difficult, before the 20s, late 20s, it's very difficult to photograph in the London fog because it's called pea super for a reason, it's yellow. And earlier films and emulsions were insensitive to yellow and the yellow-red end of the spectrum, which meant that the fog appeared blacker than it does to our eyes. So it made it even more impenetrable, even more difficult to photograph. By the 30s, this isn't the case, and these photographs are using the fog to create a shallow depth of field within the image. So it's a sort of stand-in for shallow depth of field. It creates really great silhouettes. And they make a lot of use of archways and hats. And there's also a kind of very specific iconography of the fog emerging, which is to do with lamplighters, people walking with handkerchiefs in front of cars, because the only way the car could see is if you held a handkerchief in front of the headlights. The fog was so dense. There are lots of other images. The policemen with their the traffic policemen with the white cuffs on. But you also get a lot of, so there's the Bobby's helmets, there's the royal courts, there's a lot of kind of imperial imagery, there's a lot of the kind of, there's also a lot of London buses, and what it's building is this kind of imperial iconography of London. And it's strange, so you could see it as a kind of disarming of the fog. The fog was disgusting, it stank, tasted horrible, and you couldn't see in it, and it's a threat to your life. But it translated photographically. It became romantic, it became beautiful, and it evoked both the industriousness of the city and also its very unique elements like Piccadilly Circus, London buses, all the stuff that still gets promoted as London. So it becomes a sign of symbols of the imperial metropole, because remember this is at the kind of height of empire, but also the beginning of the crumbling of empire. Okay, so This is another beginning, the creature. You can go, ooh, if you want. So the other way, the way the book actually begins in chapter 1 is here. This is in Ilford's current factory. It's now called Harman Technology, the company that make Ilford films. And the factory is in Mobley. So Ilford had a factory in Mobley, which is just a little tiny village outside Manchester, since about 1928-ish, I think. They took it over from the Rajah Film Company. And this shows you the kind of control room where they can see into the coating room. And this film was made, I only found this film the other day because I was thinking, how do I illustrate this to people, what I saw, because it's not in the book. But this film was made in 2021. I went there in 2019 and saw exactly this. So that you can't go into this room, the coating room, because the film is too sensitive. It's, you know, the oil in humans' hands, the gases in our breath, the metals. The machines have to be made of silver because photographic materials react to other metals. So the whole room is climate controlled and rigorously air washed to ensure that, that the product is as good as possible. And the coating bed, which you see there, is so big I can't get it in a picture, and neither could the film that they made. So I stitched together their panning shot, but I still couldn't get the end of it. So this is a drawing they have on the wall in the corridor outside the control room, but you can't step back to take a photograph of it, and it's very, very wide. Anyway, so it travels buildings, it travels the length of buildings. It's tens of meters long, hundreds of meters long. And I was looking at this, and I started to think, oh, this is like, it's like a dragon in a cave. It's like a creature that has been, and I was reminded of Teresa, who's here, of her writing around Plato's cave, and also all of the books in photography that talk about Plato's cave as a beginning way to explain photography. And this idea of this, there's this creature in a cave who's so sensitive that we can't possibly touch it or expose it to light or let anything near it. So I started to think of it as almost animate. And then I started thinking about emulsion, and we were given a tour of the factory and shown the emulsion, how complex and sophisticated the manufacture of emulsion is. And in the 1920s and 30s, Ilford advertised their Silo film, which was their consumer film for amateurs, as the power behind the lens, which I think is a really accurate thing, because most histories of photography, when they talk about technology at all, they talk about the cameras, but they very rarely talk about emulsion. And yet emulsion is in many ways the power behind the film, behind the lens, but also it's the thing that powers photography, because it determines things like, you know, whether the image is grainy or not, whether what the ISO of the image is, you know. So it's the sensitive surface on which the image registers. And if you look through they have these things in the Redbridge archives called I think it's called a label book, and it's full of all of the labels of everything that Ilford ever made and all of its subsidiary companies, so you can see the packaging for everything. And what I found really interesting is how in the 1920s and 30s this becomes really specialised. So they're trying to tame this creature, this wild creature that senses everything, that's sensitive to far more than just light, is being trained and channeled into specific uses. And these are different, I mean, they're also different films in the sense of what they're wound on and the length and so on, but there are different kinds of emulsions for different purposes. So you can see oscillographs, phototelegraphic film, sound recording film, contrast dental film. These could be films, or I think these four are film, but they could be plates as well. They would have similar for glass plates, and cardiographic films. So all of these different sort of scientific and technical uses for films, and each film would be designed specifically with that in mind. So film is a kind of, I started to think of photographic emulsion as a bit like a kind of silicon chip, as sort of something that was behind all of the technology of the period, something that was, you know, kind of in everything, and not just a way of making images in the way we think about it. And it's the 20s and 30s when they start building laboratories. So this is the Rodenside laboratories at Ilford. They also have the sensitometric laboratories. So this is the time when light metering gets better, when they start to control the sensitivity of the different films in a much more kind of standardized way. And the other thing that you can find in the archive are the experiment books, as I mentioned earlier, with the one with the fog on. But the thing about the experiment books that I really like is they show the other side to that control. They show the lack of control. A lot of them are titled things like Trouble with Fog, or Trouble with, it's all of the troubles, all of the difficulties, all of the things that go wrong, all of the things they can't control. Bubbles, spotting, streaking, etc. It's also the period in which they introduce properly infrared. So infrared processes start to be developed in the First World War, but it becomes more refined and better in the interwar period. And Ilford's plates were widely reputed to be the best for a long period. So this is one of the first ever photographs, because the photographic factories were highly secretive. This is one of the first ever photographs taken inside a photographic factory in the dark using an infrared. So in this time, the films are getting, even the consumer film, the CeeLo film, which is for amateurs to use, they're getting more and more refined, and they're getting faster, which means that you can take you can capture motion more easily. And you can see these are 1930s show cards, but you can see the influence of kind of Russian constructivism with the divers, people like Rodchenko's divers, but you can also see the influence of kind of all the dance magazines with the pictures of Nijinsky or whoever leaping through the air. But what I find quite interesting about these is the film would have only been our equivalent of I'm saying this for the technical people in the room, it would have been the equivalent of 100 ISO. So not super fast. You could only take a picture in bright light in the summer, and none of these people, the cartwheeling guy, I guess he's left the ground, but the others are teetering. They're kind of semi-move flying, so they're evoking flight. But so the film is marketed as a way of kind of being in the world. It's not just look, it's fast film, but look, we are fast modern people. We are moving in a modern way, wearing swimsuits and going on holidays, which is also a brand new thing. And so I'm interested in the kind of chemistry of the film. And I've said that the films were being refined like infrared and so on towards different spectral sensitivities in this period. Now, the way that was done was through dyes, and it was made possible by coal tar. So coal tar is made usually by gasworks. So when they were making coal gas, they would coke the coal, and a byproduct of the process of coking is coal tar. It was discovered in the 1850s that you could make artificial dyes out of that, and out of the coal tar dye industry sprung sprung out of the coal tar sprung all of these amazing colours that were developed through the late 19th century. So the beginning of artificial colours, but also photosensitive dyes that could respond to light in different ways. And so this was what they were adding to the films from about the 1870s onwards, adding to emulsions to kind of try and nuance and change the spectral sensitivity of the film. So back to the black stuff. So coal. Photography then is dependent on coal. And this has been noted first in 1936 by Kenneth Mies, who was the British head of research at Kodak, the whole Kodak company, and also this guy, Dr. Hugo Schweitzer, writing in 1906 at the anniversary of the coal tar dye industry, when he says Kodak fiends are the direct offshoots of the coal tar industry. In other words, we've got the coal tar to thank for the paparazzi. We've got coal tar to thank for the snap shooter. If it wasn't for this black stuff, coal tar, we wouldn't have snapshot photography and we wouldn't have the paparazzi. So in the UK in particular, I think we think of coal as a historic thing because it is part of this country's history. But by the 1990s, the coal power stations were being knocked down. So after Thatcher closed the coal mines, the coal industry in this country comes to an end. So we think of it as being in the past. But to understand its place, I'll show that it's not of the past, but to understand its relationship to photography, there are many ways of understanding it. First of all, it's in the coal tar dyes in the film itself. Secondly, the factories were driven by coal, so they weren't originally they didn't have electrical generators and so on. They were driven by coal. But even if they had been driven by electricity, the electricity would have been made from coal. But also the steamships that kind of made the British Empire, allowed trade across the British Empire, were coal-driven. And the British Empire was coal-driven in the sense that one of the ways in which Britain established its empire was by establishing coal depots or bunkers across the world. So it controlled the coal supplies for all of the steamships, which made it very difficult to not have to pay taxes and tariffs to the UK. So this shows the beginning. So this handbook for Imperial, I mean the name tells you everything. Imperial was one of the companies that was taken over by Ilford. It shows a battleship driven by steam. By the end of the First World War, of course, battleships are already kind of outdated in many ways. And then Ilford's own logo, introduced in 1886, which lasted for a very long time, shows a steam-driven paddle steamer. So, coal, just to make my point that coal is not in the past. So the amount of coal that's burned all the time now has far exceeded by many hundreds of times the amount of coal burnt during the entire Industrial Revolution in Britain. And global use of coal hit a record high in 2024. I'm sure it's gone higher again since. Graham Harwood did this piece of work in 2010 called coal-fired computers. And I think it makes the point quite well because our images are still coal-fired. So if you think about your digital images, most data centers that you are using, so there's no such thing as the cloud, you're using a data center, and those are coal-fired. In the US in particular, the data centers are in the coal, gas and oil dependent states. They use far more carbon than other industries. In 2024, data centers in the US use the same amount of electricity as the whole of Thailand. But that's going up so fast now. They keep comparing it to different countries. One AI, they say, is Ireland, and then it's Japan. So the AI consumption alone, just in 2024, and a lot has changed since then, could power more than 7.2 million US homes for a year. So that's just really to make the point that coal is still relevant. Okay, so in terms of thinking about how you kind of understand what photography was like for people in the 1920s and 30s, I thought one of the best ways is to go to the Boots archive, because Boots had the photographic department, and Boots, some of you will remember taking your films to Boots to get them processed. People were doing that in the 1920s and 30s. They were also buying their cameras in Boots. It's one of the few places where a man would have how to use a camera explained to him by a woman. And I don't know how that went down at the time. But also it was throughout the 1920s, Boots was American owned. So it ceased to be at the end of the 1920s, but for a decade or so it was. And they had a deal with Kodak. So often in their merchandise bulletin, which you can see here, which was given to all the sales staff, it said things like, push the Kodak, push the Kodak. So they were told to promote the Kodak. But it also, you can kind of, when you look at boots, you can kind of see capitalism in action in a way. You can see the photographic companies and the stores coming together to kind of promote certain ways of taking photographs in certain times. And one of the things that happens in this period is that as these films get faster, it becomes possible to step outside of the photographic season. So photography had a season. It started in April, it ended in September. In September, the photographic department in the big branches of Boots would sell toasters and flashlights and become an electrical store. In the rural areas, they sold rat poison or something, I don't know. But once you could start taking, because Britain's so dark, you know, if you were in Canada or something, it'd be a different story. But in the UK, it's so dark by September that you couldn't really, with a box brownie and a normal, ordinary consumer film, take decent photographs. You'd have to have a really good camera. So what they started to do was sell lamps for photography. They started to sell flashes. They started to develop light meters. And from the late 1920s through the 30s, you see a massive development in this. And at the same time, the companies are issuing booklets saying, go out and take photos at night, take photos in the winter, because they've spent all this time going, just take photos on your summer holidays. Photography is all about the summer holidays. And now they're trying to backtrack wildly and go, no, photograph the baby in the bathtub with this flash. So there's a kind of push to say photography has to become a 24/7 thing. We're not quite that, but photography should be something you do all the time. But what's interesting as well is when they promote London through these night photography brochures, you can sort of see that they're encouraging a kind of night tourism, a kind of like go out into the city at night when you wouldn't normally. But they do it in a very safe and staid way. So go to Westminster, it's like, oh. Whereas, but at the same time, you've got a kind of written literature saying you should go to Soho and see the gambling dens and all this kind of thing. And it's a highly kind of racist, imperial kind of literature of the sort of the jungle of the East End or the jungle of Soho. And this, but this is kind of what I argue is this is the flip side of that. This is still the kind of emphasis on empire. I'll come to empire in a minute, but I thought I've probably been talking for quite a long time now, so I'll wake you up. I wanted to tell you about Byron and his poem Darkness, written in 1816. But I was thinking about those two songs every time. I spoke at a conference in Manchester recently, which was called Darkness. And every time I was thinking about darkness, those two songs kept going around in my head. One is called Zweistromland by the Becketts, and the other one is Blood and Fire by Nini the Observer. But the Beckett's one refers to it was a dark and stormy night, which is the reputedly the most cliched start to any story in the English language. But it's also the start to my book, someone pointed out to me, because the because before I wrote the first chapter, there's like a little paragraph and it says, "It was born in a storm and in darkness." And then someone I know said, it was a dark and stormy night. So, but also the let it burn thing was because obviously I'm thinking a lot at the moment about AI and the burning of the world, and also thinking about what's going on in Iran. Anyway, this is the Villa Diodati, where Byron stayed in 1816 and where he wrote the poem Darkness, which in the conference at Manchester, I won't go into the details here, but I read as a kind of proto-photographic poem because it's about wanting the light to look into one another's faces, so like the portrait mania. Anyway, this is a later engraving, but Byron was staying there on the shores of Lake Geneva with a group of people. This is a famous story, but I'll tell you in case you don't know. With the two Shelley sisters, Mary and her younger sister, whose name I've forgotten, maybe Claire, I'm not sure, and John Polidori, who was his physician, and also Percy Shelley, shouldn't forget him. So at that time, as well as Byron writing The Darkness, Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein, and John Polidori wrote The Vampire, which is based on sexy Byron, so it's the first sexy vampire. And but one of the things that's interesting about this, and it's been written about a lot, this isn't my research, but this happened in the year without a summer. So 1816, we now know, followed 1815, that's not surprising. But in 1815, there was the eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia. Mount Tambora was had this huge volcanic eruption which created a big kind of girdle of dust around the world. And the Napoleonic Wars had just ended in Europe. It was already kind of on the verge of starvation. And then this year, none of the crops come in 1816 by the time the kind of dust reaches Europe. So all across the world, people are starving. But this summer never comes. So while Byron and the Shelleys are at Lake Geneva, it's dark. There are massive storms, huge rainfall, and they're forced inside where they tell each other ghost stories. So that's the kind of origin story of those books and stories. But something else is happening at the same time, or just slightly earlier. So here's the Villa Diodati, and up there is Chalon-sur-Saône, where Nicéphore Niepce is busy inventing photography. So what a year to invent photography, the darkest year, the year without a summer. And it's not easy. So he makes 4 paper images which no longer exist because they're actually negatives, but of course he didn't know what a negative was, so he wouldn't have called it that. He called them retinas. They were on little pieces of paper, and he posted them to his brother Claude and said, look, here are some samples of what I've been doing, and this is what they look like. I've got to figure out how to stop them being so ephemeral and how to make the dark colours light and the light colours dark. But he also sends a second letter where he says, I forgot to tell you in my previous letter, it's not necessary for the sun to be shining. And that's really important because the sun is not shining, because it's the year without a summer. And although he will later call this process heliography, call photography heliography, he's actually trying to emphasize that it's not just about the sun. It doesn't have to be a bright sunny day, although because the exposures are really, really long. And he gives up in the end. It is too difficult. And his farm is flooding, and he's forced to stop photography and do something else instead. So that's the kind of aborted birth of photography, I suppose. But the other thing to say is that he had previously, with Claude, invented a combustion engine called the pyréolophore. I can't say it. And combustion was one of the ways in which photography was thought about. And the other time I've come across the word combustion being used, photography as a process of chemical combustion, is in the really earliest inventor of photography in Europe, which is Elizabeth Fulham, writing in the 1890s an essay on a combustion with a view to a new art of dyeing and painting, where she describes the photographic process. So the very first one was a woman, which is nice. But this idea of combustion as well is what's there also in Byron's poem. So the Romantics are really aware of the Industrial Revolution. They're thinking about with Frankenstein and with Darkness, the dangers of humanity's kind of going against nature, if you like, stealing the fire of life and that kind of thing. Empire. You can boo. Or hiss, So, I mentioned the handbooks with the imperial connections. One of the things that happens in the First World War, so empire and war are intricately connected in my book, and one of the things that happens is that the war gets described as the chemist's war. Chemistry flourishes. Obviously, poison gases are invented, but also the chemical industries flourish, and with them, the photographic industry. So photography gets a boost from the First World War. In the book, I talk about tropicalization, which is it's a term that Krista Thompson uses to describe the way in which Europeans and Americans kind of approached the places they deemed to be tropical. They didn't have to be literally tropical. They just kind of thought of them as the tropics because they're hot, wet places. And so I look at how the photography industry constructs the tropics as this kind of exceptional place, and how there's these really bizarre stories in the 1920s in the letters pages of the photographic press, people writing saying, it's really hard to take photographs in Nigeria. I have to be in my tent at night, and there's creatures landing in it, and the emulsion becomes like jelly, and all of this sort of thing. But actually, we know that since the late 19th century, there was a flourishing Nigerian photographic industry, or photo studios and so on, who were importing Ilford plates, and we can see it in the records of what Ilford was importing and exporting. So they could have just, taken it to get developed by other people working on the coast, but instead they'd recommend sending your plates back to England. And this Kodak one also shows that kind of grasping. It's later, it's from 1952, but it shows the way in which colour film is getting conflated with people of colour, and also the idea of local colour. And it's this, if you can see it in colour, you can get it in colour. So it's that kind of grasping trophy mentality, extractive mentality. And when I said the empire is crumbling, the most visible sign of this to most people in Britain is the presence of Gandhi in London for the India conferences, arriving in the fog dressed as he was, and this is kind of capitalised on by the press. And very briefly, I'll just talk quickly about this. So I also have a chapter on the Houston Mount Everest survey expedition. So what you see in this period is, as the empire is under threat, fascists, as in people who actually signed up fascists, who support Mussolini and Hitler and so on, in Britain, decide to do a survey expedition over Mount Everest to prove to the Indian population that Britain still got it. And what do they use? Ilford plates. So I mentioned they had very great infrared plates. Panchromatic plates they're black and white still, but they are the Ilford HP film hyperpanchromatic. It corresponds most closely to the spectral range of your eyes. And so HP film, or panchromatic plates in this case, are also very good at cutting through blue haze, so they're good for aerial photography, and were used for that. Okay, this is the end. The goal. So the goal is this little thing. I wanted to talk about the way that photography is not just a kind of human thing. So remember, I started with it as a creature. So I wanted to think about the kind of animal element of photography, not just things like gelatine, but how this kind of symbiosis between animal and plant had led to the idea of the latent image, and how that had influenced the whole way we think, including Freud's psychoanalysis. So a goal, I'm not going to give a very good technical explanation here, but it's basically when a wasp injects a plant and then lays an egg, and the plant grows a protective shell around the egg. So you end up with these things, if you've ever seen them, they're really, they look like kind of ping pong ball size, the good ones, the ones they considered good. And they have a little insect inside who will burrow its way out eventually and fly away. These have a high level of tannins in them, and they produce gallic acid, and gallic acid is the first developer. And gallic acid may be why the very first images made by Thomas Wedgwood and Humphrey Davy were on leather, because tanneries also had high amounts of tannins and could sometimes have gallic acid. It would ruin the leather usually, but there could be trace elements of gallic acid in it, which would increase the exposure. So gallic acid means that you don't just have these slow exposing printout processes like cyanotype or whatever, where you just, am I right with cyanotype? Or do you develop? No, you just wash it, don't you? Yeah, so where you just wait for the image to appear. Instead, the image is invisible until you develop it. You put it in the gallic acid. What that means is, it raises this question, where is the image gone? Between, what is a latent image? How can it travel so far from its original source? And people found it really difficult to explain the latent image. It wasn't until the 1930s that they actually understood how it worked scientifically. But the latent image was thanks to a collaboration between a wasp and a tree, an oak tree called the dyer's oak, because it produced, the oak tree is called the dyer's oak because these galls also produce the ink, a very black ink and a very black dyes. The ink's used for legal documents. Anyway, these are the camels that would bring the sacks of galls off the trees to, that workers had plucked from the trees, to the port of Smyrna to export them to places like Britain. And the camels, these bags would rub against their side and create sores, and those sores are also called galls. So there's a connection between the bitterness of the gallbladder, the bitterness of the gall, which is incredibly, anything with lots of tannin in, like acorns, is going to be bitter. The bitter feeling of having something rubbing or chafing against you, and your gallbladder, these are all connected through the idea of bitterness. Anyway, so I end the book by trying to show that even the whole way we think about the world doesn't just come conjured up from us, but comes from the activities of other creatures, such as trees and wasps. Okay, I'm done.
Does anyone have any questions or comments for Michelle?
Hi. I just wanted to ask a bit more about the gallic acid. So
Yes.
Is it still only coming from galls on oak trees, or have they now found other ways,
Well,
or are they using other things now?
Developer is no longer made from gallic acid. There are other chemicals that make developer. So gallic acid was used, first of all, they just used gallic acid, and then they made this thing called pyrogallol, which is made by heating it, and that was the kind of first fast developer. But now, you've got photography technicians sitting behind you, can ask them afterwards. I don't know what developer's made of anymore. I'm stuck in the 20s and 30s. No, but early developers were gallic acid, but it isn't any longer. And that trade from the Middle East obviously no longer exists.
Fascinating.
I'm sorry to only jump on the gallic acid question, but it's fascinating. How was it discovered that this weird symbiosis between wasps and trees could develop photographs? Do you know?
I'll go back to it. We think that, what's his name, who really invented photography?
Ness something. Ness, the French guy?
Yes. No. Anyway, someone else told Fox Talbot to use it, and he went and bought some from a chemist on Oxford Street. So it's Talbot who introduced it to photography, but the other man whose name I will remember sometime in the future. Herschel, thank you. John Herschel. They think told him about it. But there was also quite a lot of people knew that gallic acid had very strange qualities. So it was already used in the dye works in India, for example, for making black cloth. So they already had a lot of knowledge about it. And the ink is utterly permanent, so it's used only for legal documents. I don't know if it's still used. It's sometimes called iron gull ink or something like that, but you can sometimes find the ink still. You can buy it in little pots. Oak gull ink. Yeah.
I have a question. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about how you came up with the structure of the book. The way you presented it was kind of around the main themes, but the 36 essays and sort of, that's so creative and interesting. I wonder, how did that happen?
Okay, the book's structured in 36 short chapters of about 2,000 words each. And it was because I was in the middle of writing it as a conventional book, so I was trying to write, like an academic book is usually about 7,000 words a chapter, roughly, 7,000, 8,000. So I was writing it like that, but I was boring myself. And I was also struggling to keep the narrative going across the sections, so I'd have 2,000 word sections within the chapters. And then I got asked to write an essay on the photographer Lucia Maholi for an exhibition in Prague. I was asked to write 2 essays on her, and I absolutely loved doing it. And I did very research intensive, but only 2,000 words. So you had to be incredibly disciplined, and you had to sort of start a story. You had to have a narrative arc in it. And I really liked it. It was like storytelling. But also I read a lot of novels, and I noticed that novels have a lot more chapters than academic books, and they're shorter. And it's much easier at night to just put it down when you finish at a chapter break. So yeah, that's where it came from. But the 36, obviously, was because that's the number of exposures in one of the common number of exposures in a 35mm film. I also think 36 exposures is 5 foot, which because you want to hang it up. So don't know what that's got to do with it.
It's a nice symmetry. We have time maybe for one more question or comment. Thank you. Okay. Oh, the cafe's closing, by the way, in 5 minutes.
Has it changed, having done all this research and written this book, do you think it's changed the way that you now view photographs or make your own?
It's certainly changed the way I view photographs of fog.
But do you see the whole history behind it now when you're looking at things?
Yes, yeah, I do. But I'll tell you what, it's changed more. And actually, because I read a lot of environmental books, a lot of books around ecology and the environment and so on, in order to write it. And I understood about coal and the byproducts of coal and how we're still living with them and how dangerous they are, how cancerous they are, and how much. So you think of like the byproducts of the coal tar industry include DDT, for example, if any of you remember that. The poison gases that we, Zyklon B, these horrible, horrible substances that came out, but also the dye factories. You had, like, people were dying of bladder cancer in the dye factories, and chimney sweeps got cancer of the scrotum. So there were the first ever industrial diseases were identified through the coal tar dye factories. And what that left me with, especially when I just finished writing, I've kind of calmed down now, but when I just finished writing, it was like I couldn't not see the contamination of the earth. It was really hard not to be able to sort of bracket it off. It felt like I lived in a very contaminated world. But the book's more cheery than that.
It's fascinating. Thank you, everyone, for your questions and comments and for spending some time with us and for joining us in celebrating the publication of Michelle Henning's new book. We have some on sale, and there's a special price for this evening, and she'll be signing them as well. But please join me in giving a round of applause and thanking Michelle for tonight.